Chapter 1. Whispers Beneath the Floorboards. The house stood at the edge of a withering forest, its silhouette a jagged shadow against the twilight sky. Time had not been kind to it, though it seemed untouched by decay. The wooden frame appeared warped, as though straining against some unseen pressure, and the windows, though cracked and dusty, gleamed faintly, reflecting a light that did not come from the sun. This was the house no one dared approach, where the locals warned of things better left undisturbed. Isla Greenwood had been an outsider all her life, and when the inheritance letter arrived, delivered in an envelope so old the paper disintegrated at her touch, she felt the pull of something strange and inescapable. The house had belonged to an estranged aunt she barely remembered, a recluse whose name was muttered in hushed tones whenever mentioned. With no other ties and a life defined by transience, Isla packed her belongings and drove until the skeletal trees of the forgotten forest swallowed the road. The first steps into the house were met with a wave of cold, so biting it felt alive. Her boots scuffed against warped floorboards that groaned beneath her weight, a sound that echoed as though the house itself were breathing in reply. Dust swirled in the fading light, disturbed by Isla's movements, but seeming to settle faster than it should, as though reluctant to leave its place. The air carried a faint metallic scent, mingling with the sharper tang of mildew and decay. Yet, beneath it all, there was something floral, something faintly sweet, like a bouquet left too long to wilt. Isla's eyes caught on a photograph hanging crookedly on the wall. It was a faded image of two women, one young and smiling, the other older, her face blurred and shadowed. Beneath the photo was a brass plate engraved with names she couldn't read through the tarnish. As the night deepened, the house revealed more of its unsettling character. Doors creaked open when Isla turned away, only to be closed again when she returned her gaze. The sound of faint whispers drifted up from the floorboards, so soft they might have been mistaken for the rustling of leaves. But there were no leaves, only silence outside, and the oppressive weight of the house within. In the parlor, a grandfather clock stood tall, its face blank, hands missing entirely. Isla found herself drawn to it despite its broken state. She reached out to touch its surface, but the moment her fingers brushed the wood, a deep, resonant chime echoed through the house. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the walls, the floor, and into her chest. Startled, Isla staggered back, her pulse quickening. The clock remained motionless, its face an empty void, but the sound lingered in the air, merging with the whispers from below. They grew louder now, almost insistent, like a plea she couldn't quite understand. She stepped away, her hand trembling as she clutched at her coat, and her gaze fell to the floorboards beneath the clock. A dark stain spread across the wood, faint but unmistakable, its shape amorphous yet somehow deliberate. Isla knelt to inspect it, the floral scent stronger now, cloying and sharp. Her fingers traced the edge of the stain, and as her touch connected with the wood, a sensation surged through her. A pulse, faint but steady, like the beat of a heart. Her breath caught as the whispers rose again, sharper this time, almost forming words. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she backed away from the clock and the stain. Something was alive in this house, something that had waited for her. The last light of day faded beyond the windows, and as darkness consumed the house, Isla realized she had not turned on a single light. She fumbled for the switch nearest the door, but the bulb flickered once and died, leaving her bathed in the suffocating blackness of the house. The whispers became a roar, circling her, surrounding her, and she felt the floorboards tremble beneath her feet. And then, just as quickly as it began, the noise stopped. The air grew still, heavy, and oppressive. From somewhere deep within the house, there came the sound of something moving, a slow, deliberate scrape, as though wood was being dragged against wood. Isla's breath hitched as she stood frozen in place. The house was awake now, and it had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Flickering Lantern. Night in the house seemed heavier than outside, as though the shadows gathered here were more than the absence of light. They pressed against Isla's skin, thick and stifling, whispering in her ears even when the air was still. She moved carefully, her steps hesitant as the creaking floorboards betrayed her every motion. There was no escaping the sense that she was being watched, though her eyes met only emptiness wherever she turned. The flashlight she carried was dim, its weak beam swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The bulb flickered occasionally, casting jittery shadows that danced along the peeling wallpaper. She had found it tucked inside a dusty drawer in the kitchen, its surface coated with grime, as though waiting for her arrival. The batteries had been nearly drained, yet the faint glow it provided was a fragile lifeline. Isla's first task had been to find the source of the dragging noise she'd heard earlier. It had seemed to come from somewhere below, beneath the floorboards, perhaps, or from a cellar the house had yet to reveal. Every step toward the center of the parlor, where the grandfather clock loomed, felt as though she were descending further into the unknown. The air was colder here, tinged with the scent of damp earth and something acrid. Her beam caught the edge of a trapdoor she hadn't noticed earlier, its outline barely discernible against the warped planks. The handle was rusted, a tarnished ring of iron that resisted her grip at first. When it finally yielded, the wood groaned as the door swung upward, revealing a dark, yawning void below. The smell of mildew and decay surged upward, thick and nauseating. A small, tarnished lantern rested on the first step of the descending staircase, its glass cloudy with age but otherwise intact. Isla hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers trembling as they brushed its cold surface. The moment she lifted the lantern, the flashlight sputtered and died, plunging her into total darkness. A faint sound, like the exhale of a breath, seemed to rise from below, stirring the air around her. Frantically, she fumbled with the lantern's mechanism, finding a matchbox tucked beneath it. The matches were brittle, their tips crumbling at the first strike, but finally, a flame flared to life. It illuminated the lantern's interior, which contained a wick soaked in oil that should have dried out years ago. Yet as she lit it, the flame burned steady and strong, casting a warm but eerie glow that painted the walls with shifting shadows. The stairs beneath the trapdoor creaked ominously as Isla descended, each step accompanied by the faint vibration of the house itself. The space below was low-ceilinged and cramped, the walls damp with condensation. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe, and the floor was a patchwork of uneven stones, as though it had been hastily constructed. The lantern's light caught on something metallic in the corner, a chain bolted to the wall, its links heavy and rusted. Beside it lay a scattering of objects that made Isla's stomach churn. A rotting scrap of fabric, stained with something dark, a tarnished locket, its clasp broken, and an old comb, its teeth worn down to jagged stubs. Each item seemed deliberately placed, as though part of some forgotten ritual. The whispers began again, louder now, their cadence frantic and insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the damp walls and vibrating through the stones. Isla clutched the lantern tighter, her knuckles white as she tried to make sense of the sound. The voices overlapped, fragments of language lost in a storm of noise. Her gaze was drawn to a peculiar marking on the far wall, a series of symbols etched into the stone, faintly glowing as the lantern's light touched them. They were unfamiliar, jagged and interlocking, forming a pattern that seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. The sight of them sent a shiver down her spine, a primal fear surging through her veins. As she stepped closer, The air grew colder still, her breath visible in the dim light. The lantern flickered, its flames sputtering, and the whispers surged into a deafening roar. Then, silence fell, sudden and absolute, as if the house itself were holding its breath. From the darkness beyond the lantern's glow, something shifted. The sound was soft at first, like the brush of fabric against stone, but it grew louder with each passing moment, a dragging, shuffling noise that drew nearer. Isla's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled back, the lantern's light trembling with her movements. The shadows seemed to swell, creeping closer, and then, from the blackness, a shape emerged. It was indistinct, its edges blurred and shifting, but its presence was undeniable. The air around it seemed to hum with energy, a low vibration that resonated in Isla's bones. Frozen in place, she watched as the figure halted just beyond the lantern's reach, its form writhing like smoke caught in a vortex. It did not move closer, but she felt its gaze, a weight that pressed down on her, pinning her in place. The lantern's light dimmed further, the flame shrinking until it was little more than an ember. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure receded, melting back into the darkness. The lantern flared back to life, its flame steady once more, and the whispers returned, softer this time, almost mournful. Isla stood trembling, the cold seeping into her bones as she struggled to make sense of what she had seen. The air felt heavier now, laden with an unspoken threat. She turned back to the staircase, her steps hurried and uneven as she climbed out of the cellar, the trapdoor slamming shut behind her with a force that made her jump. The house seemed quieter now, though its silence was far from comforting. The lantern's glow flickered as Isla moved back into the parlor, her mind racing with questions she dared not answer. She had entered the house of shadows, and the darkness within it was watching. Chapter 3: Eyes in the Keyhole. The morning brought no relief. The sunlight that filtered through the cracked windows of the house was dim and sickly, its golden hue dulled as though diluted by the heavy air that filled every room. Isla lay awake on the old, musty mattress she had found in one of the upstairs bedrooms, her body rigid from the tension of a night spent listening to the house breathe. Sleep had been a fleeting, fractured thing, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures and whispered words she couldn't understand. She forced herself to rise, the chill of the wooden floor biting through her socks as she moved to the window. The forest outside stretched endlessly, the trees gnarled and twisted, their bare branches clawing at the sky. There was no sign of life, no sound of birds or rustling leaves. It was as though the house had stolen the world's vitality and locked it away in its endless darkness. Isla descended the creaking staircase cautiously, her every step met with a groan from the wood beneath her feet. The parlor was as she had left it, the grandfather clock still standing silently, its face an empty void. The stain beneath it had grown darker overnight, its edges sharper, as though the wood itself were being consumed. Her gaze drifted to the trapdoor she had closed the night before. It remained shut, the rusted ring of the handle catching the pale light, but something about it felt different now. The air around it was colder, heavier, as though the cellar below still reached for her. Seeking distraction, Isla explored the other rooms of the house, hoping to find some clue as to its history or her connection to it. The hallway stretched endlessly, lined with doors that appeared identical but opened into vastly different spaces. One room held only a single chair in its center, its wooden surface worn and splintered, as though something had clawed at it. Another was filled with bookshelves that leaned precariously, their contents reduced to piles of ash and brittle fragments of paper. But it was the locked door at the end of the hall that drew her attention most. Its surface was pristine compared to the rest of the house, its paint unchipped and its brass keyhole polished to a gleaming shine. She tried the handle, but it didn't budge, and when she pressed her ear against the door, she thought she could hear something faint, a rhythmic thudding, like the beat of a distant drum. The sound sent a chill down her spine, but curiosity outweighed caution. Isla crouched, peering through the keyhole, her breath catching as she squinted into the dimness beyond. The room on the other side was bathed in an eerie, golden light that seemed to come from nowhere. At its center stood a figure, its back turned to her, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of its shoulders. It was impossible to discern any details about the figure. Its form was cloaked in shadow despite the strange light. Isla's heart pounded as she leaned closer, straining to see more. Then, without warning, the figure moved. Its head turned sharply, as though sensing her gaze, and a pair of eyes met hers through the keyhole. They were not human. The pupils were elongated and slitted, surrounded by an iridescent glow that shifted colors like oil on water. The sight of them sent a jolt of terror through Isla, and she stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The rhythmic thudding from beyond the door grew louder, faster, and the handle began to rattle violently, as though whatever was inside was trying to break free. Isla fled down the hallway, her footsteps echoing as she reached the stairs and descended into the parlor. The house seemed alive now, its walls groaning and the floor trembling beneath her. The whispers she had heard the night before returned, louder and more insistent, their overlapping voices forming a cacophony that filled her ears. She clutched at the lantern, which she had left on the parlor table, and lit it with shaking hands. The flame flickered wildly, casting chaotic shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. Isla pressed herself against the far wall, her eyes darting around the room as the whispers reached a fever pitch. The grandfather clock chimed suddenly, its deep, resonant tone reverberating through the house. Isla's gaze snapped to it, and her stomach dropped as she saw the hands of the clock moving, though there were no gears to power them. They ticked forward erratically, sometimes pausing, sometimes leaping ahead, as though marking time in a rhythm only the house understood. The trapdoor creaked open on its own, revealing the staircase to the cellar once more. From its depths rose a faint glow, the same golden light she had seen through the keyhole. The scent of burning lilies filled the air, cloying and sharp, and Isla felt an invisible pull, a compulsion to descend once more into the shadows below. But she resisted, clutching the lantern tightly and retreating toward the front door. Her hand fumbled for the handle, but it was locked, the deadbolt refusing to budge. Panic surged as she rattled the door, her knuckles white with the effort, but the house held firm. The whispers grew softer, more melodic, as though coaxing her to stay. The air around her grew warmer, almost suffocating, and she realized the golden light was creeping up the stairs, spilling into the parlor like liquid fire. It pooled around her feet, shimmering and shifting, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though stepping into it would mean losing herself entirely. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the light receded, flowing back down the stairs and disappearing into the depths of the cellar. The trapdoor slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, and the whispers faded into silence. Isla slumped against the door, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The house had tested her, toyed with her, and she had barely escaped. But deep down, she knew it was far from over. The House of Shadows was alive, and it was waiting. Chapter 4. The Room That Shouldn't Be. The days passed with an eerie monotony, each one feeling longer than the last, as though time itself stretched within the confines of the house. Isla had taken to marking each day with scratches on the wall near the staircase, a futile attempt to ground herself in a reality that seemed to unravel further with each passing hour. Sleep eluded her more and more, replaced by fitful moments of restless exhaustion punctuated by the house's ceaseless noises, whispers, creaks, and the rhythmic thudding that sometimes echoed through the walls. On the fourth day, or perhaps the fifth, she couldn't be sure, Isla discovered the room. It began as a curiosity, a faint draft in the hallway upstairs that she hadn't noticed before. The air seemed to hum faintly, carrying with it a scent she couldn't quite place, something both sweet and decayed. She followed the draft, her footsteps tentative as it led her to the far end of the corridor, to a door she was certain hadn't been there before. The door was unlike the others in the house. While the others were weathered and warped, this one seemed pristine, its surface smooth and polished to a mirror-like sheen. It reflected the faint glow of her lantern, the light twisting and bending in ways that made her stomach churn. There was no handle, only a small, circular indent at its center, like the imprint of a coin pressed into soft clay. Isla stood before it for what felt like hours, her fingers brushing the indent but finding no mechanism to push, pull, or turn. Yet, despite the lack of any visible way to open it, the door gave way at her touch, swinging inward on silent hinges. The air within the room was warmer than the rest of the house, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood. The lantern's glow illuminated walls that were entirely wrong, not flat, but curved, as though the room were the inside of some great ribcage. The surface was dark, not wood or plaster, but something organic, slick and faintly pulsing. Isla's breath caught in her throat as she stepped inside, the lantern shaking in her grip. The floor beneath her feet was soft, yielding slightly with each step, and she had to steady herself against the wall to keep her balance. Her fingers recoiled as they touched the surface, which was warm and damp, the sensation leaving an unpleasant residue on her skin. She wiped her hand on her coat, her movements frantic as the room seemed to close in around her. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, carved from the same unidentifiable material as the walls. Upon it rested an object that made Isla's blood run cold. A small wooden box, its lid adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shift under her gaze. The symbols on the box were familiar, echoing the ones she had seen etched into the cellar walls, but here they pulsed faintly, as though alive. Isla approached the pedestal cautiously, her instincts screaming at her to leave, to run as far as she could. Yet something compelled her forward, an invisible force pulling her closer. The whispers began again, soft and melodic, filling the room with a sound that was almost beautiful if not for the underlying menace. Her hands trembled as she reached for the box, her fingertips brushing its surface. The carvings seemed to respond to her touch, glowing brighter and shifting more rapidly, their patterns weaving into something she couldn't comprehend. When she lifted the lid, the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through her entire body. Inside the box was an object wrapped in a piece of cloth, so old it crumbled at her touch. As the fabric fell away, Isla's breath caught in her throat. Nestled within was a key, its surface blackened and corroded, yet it exuded a strange energy that made the air around it feel thicker. The key was long and ornate, its handle shaped into a spiral that seemed to twist endlessly, drawing her gaze into its depths. The moment her fingers closed around the key, the room shifted violently. The walls contracted, the pulsing rhythm growing faster and louder, like the heartbeat of a great beast. The whispers returned, louder than ever, overlapping in a chaotic storm of voices that seemed to come from all directions. The pedestal collapsed into the floor, which began to ripple beneath her feet, throwing her off balance. Isla stumbled toward the door, the key clutched tightly in her hand, as the room seemed to close in on itself. The lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls, and the air grew so thick she could barely draw breath. When she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the entire house. Isla fell to her knees, gasping for air, the key still clenched in her fist. She turned back to look at the door, but it was gone, replaced by a blank stretch of wall as though the room had never existed. Her heart raced as she sat there, the whispers fading into silence once more. The key in her hand felt impossibly heavy, its strange energy pulsing faintly against her skin. She knew instinctively that it was meant for something, though what, she couldn't say. As she rose to her feet, her knees still weak, she became aware of a new sound, soft and rhythmic, like breathing, but not her own. It came from somewhere deeper in the house, a steady exhale and inhale that resonated through the walls. The house had changed again, shifting its layout and its rules. Isla clutched the key tightly, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Whatever this house wanted, whatever it was, she was no longer a guest. She was part of it now, bound by the strange, pulsing rhythm of its heart. And somewhere in its endless halls, it waited for her next move. Chapter 5. The Mirror Without Reflection. The key weighed heavily in Isla's pocket as she moved through the house, its presence a constant reminder of the strange room she could no longer find. The whispers had grown fainter since her escape, though the house still breathed around her, its walls groaning softly, as if responding to her every step. She tried to ignore it, but the sensation of being watched was unshakable, a shadow pressing against the edges of her thoughts. The morning light outside seemed weaker, barely illuminating the house's warped, dust-covered windows. Isla hadn't eaten in what felt like days, her appetite stolen by the oppressive atmosphere. Her mind was preoccupied by the key and the way its faint energy seemed to pulse in rhythm with the thudding heartbeat she sometimes heard through the walls. Whatever its purpose, she felt certain it was tied to the deeper mysteries of the house. Her exploration led her to the second-floor landing, where a long hallway stretched before her. The air here felt colder, and she could see her breath misting faintly in the dim light of her lantern. At the far end of the corridor stood a mirror, its surface so tarnished that it barely reflected her silhouette. Its ornate frame was cracked, the gold paint flaking to reveal dark, corroded wood beneath. The mirror was out of place, leaning against the wall as though it had been abandoned there. Isla approached cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the floor. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to hum, a low vibration that made her teeth ache. When she finally stood before it, she could see her reflection faintly, warped by the tarnish and the cracked glass. But something was wrong. The figure in the mirror didn't move as she did. While Isla remained still, staring into its surface, her reflection shifted slightly, tilting its head as though regarding her with curiosity. Her pulse quickened as she leaned closer, squinting to make out the details. The reflection was unmistakably her, but its eyes seemed darker, deeper, as though something else stared out from behind them. She raised a hand slowly, and the figure mirrored the motion, but the delay was noticeable now. A fraction of a second too late, its movements jerky and unnatural. Then the reflection smiled. It wasn't her smile. It was too wide, the corners of its mouth stretching unnaturally, revealing teeth that were too sharp. Isla stumbled back, her breath hitching as the figure in the mirror leaned forward, pressing its palms against the glass. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, radiating outward from its touch, and the hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through her bones. The lantern flickered wildly as the mirror began to shake, its frame rattling against the wall. Isla wanted to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot, her body frozen in place as the figure in the mirror began to push against the glass. Its hands pressed through first, followed by arms that seemed too long, the joints bending in unnatural angles. The glass rippled like water as it emerged, its movements jerky and insect-like. Just as its face began to break through, the key in Isla's pocket flared with heat, sending a jolt of pain through her leg. The sudden sensation broke her paralysis, and she stumbled backward, her hand fumbling for the key. As her fingers closed around it, the mirror erupted in a deafening crash, shards of glass flying outward in all directions. Isla threw up her arms to shield her face, the lantern slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. When she dared to lower her hands, the figure was gone. The mirror's frame was empty, its surface reduced to jagged shards that reflected the dim light in distorted patterns. But the room was not empty. A shadow lingered in the corner, darker than the surrounding gloom, its edges shifting like smoke. It didn't move toward her, but its presence was suffocating, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. Isla scrambled for the lantern, her hands shaking as she relit the flame. The light pushed back the darkness slightly, but the shadow remained, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Clutching the lantern tightly, Isla backed away, her eyes never leaving the shadow. It didn't follow, but the air around it seemed to pulse in rhythm with the key's faint energy. Whatever it wasn't bound to the mirror. It was part of the house, another thread in the web of horrors that surrounded her. Isla fled down the hallway, her footsteps echoing as she descended the stairs and returned to the parlor. The house seemed more alive now, its walls creaking and shifting as though reacting to her presence. She sank to the floor, her back against the cold stone of the fireplace, and pulled the key from her pocket. Its surface was no longer blackened. The corrosion had melted away, revealing a silvery metal that shimmered faintly in the lantern's glow. The spiral handle still seemed to twist endlessly, drawing her gaze into its depths. She felt an almost magnetic pull, as though the key wanted to guide her somewhere, to unlock something hidden deep within the house. The whispers returned, soft and melodic, drifting through the air like a lullaby. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding her in a cocoon of sound that blurred the edges of her thoughts. For a moment, Isla felt her fear begin to fade, replaced by a strange sense of calm, of belonging. Then the lantern flickered again, and the whispers turned sharp, their tone shifting to something more insistent, almost pleading. The key pulsed in her hand, its energy stronger now, pointing her toward the trapdoor in the center of the parlor. The cellar called to her again, its darkness no longer passive but alive with anticipation. The golden light from before glimmered faintly at the edges of the trapdoor, beckoning her to descend once more into its depths. Isla knew she couldn't resist forever. The house wouldn't let her. Chapter 6. A Door That Locks Itself. The trapdoor loomed before Isla like a gaping wound in the fabric of the house. Its edges seemed more pronounced now, the faint glow of golden light pulsing rhythmically from below, synchronized with the relentless thudding heartbeat that had become the house's sinister anthem. Isla sat motionless, the key warm in her palm, the spiral-shaped handle twisting endlessly, inviting her to use it. Her mind warred against itself. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to abandon this cursed place and never look back. Yet, deep down, she knew escape wasn't possible. The house wouldn't let her go. It had her in its grasp, and whatever power the key held was the only way forward. Forward into what? She didn't know. The whispers began again, faint and melodic, floating up from beneath the trapdoor. They were more distinct this time, forming words she couldn't understand but felt compelled to obey. The golden light grew stronger, casting long, flickering shadows across the parlor walls. The shadows danced and twisted, their shapes almost human but grotesquely elongated, their movements jagged and wrong. Summoning every ounce of resolve, Isla slid the key into the rusted lock embedded in the trapdoor. It fit perfectly, as though the lock had been waiting for this exact moment. With a deep breath, she turned the key. The lock clicked, and the whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against her ears like a physical weight. The golden light flared, flooding the room in a brilliance that seemed unnatural, almost alive. The trapdoor creaked open of its own accord, revealing the yawning abyss below. The stairs leading down were different this time. They were no longer wood but cold, black stone, polished to a mirror-like finish. The light from the lantern flickered weakly against their surface, swallowed almost entirely by the oppressive darkness that lay beyond. Isla hesitated at the edge, her heart pounding in time with the house's heartbeat. She descended slowly, her footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air thickened around her, pushing back against her movements. The temperature dropped with every step, the air growing colder and sharper, biting at her skin. When she reached the bottom, the golden light reappeared, emanating from a source she couldn't see. It bathed the cavernous space in an otherworldly glow, illuminating walls carved with intricate symbols that pulsed faintly, alive with the same energy as the key. The room was enormous, far larger than the house above should have allowed, its boundaries disappearing into the shadows. In the center of the space stood a monolithic altar, its surface smooth and black, reflecting the golden light like a pool of liquid. The altar was adorned with strange objects, candles that burned with flames that didn't flicker, bones arranged in intricate patterns, and a single chalice filled with a dark, viscous liquid that shimmered unnaturally. Isla approached the altar cautiously, her every step deliberate and slow. The air here was heavier, pressing against her chest and making it hard to breathe. The key in her hand grew hotter with each step, its energy now a steady, pulsing rhythm that matched the symbols carved into the walls. When she reached the altar, she noticed a depression in its surface, a small indentation that matched the shape of the key. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the spiral handle. The key seemed to hum in her hand, urging her forward, its pull impossible to resist. With a trembling hand, she placed the key into the indentation. The moment it clicked into place, the room erupted in motion. The golden light flared brighter, the symbols on the walls glowing fiercely as they began to shift and writhe, their patterns rearranging themselves into something new. The air filled with a low, resonant hum that vibrated through her entire body, and the altar began to tremble beneath her touch. From the darkness beyond the light, shapes began to emerge. At first, they were indistinct, mere shadows that moved with an unnatural fluidity. But as they drew closer, Isla could see them more clearly, twisted, humanoid forms with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to blur and shift, never settling into any recognizable shape. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, as though they were being pulled forward by invisible strings. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a chaotic storm of voices that filled the cavernous space. They spoke in a language Isla couldn't understand, their tone alternating between pleading and commanding. The shapes surrounded her, their eyeless faces turned toward her as though waiting for something. The chalice on the altar began to bubble, the dark liquid within rising and falling as though alive. Isla's gaze was drawn to it, the surface reflecting her face in distorted, fragmented pieces. She felt an overwhelming compulsion to touch it, to drink from it, though every fiber of her being screamed in protest. Before she could move, the altar shifted again, the symbols carved into its surface glowing brighter than ever. The key twisted in its slot, turning on its own as the golden light reached a blinding intensity. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air filled with a deafening roar that drowned out the whispers. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped, The light vanished, plunging the space into darkness so absolute that Isla couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. A single sound broke the stillness, a slow, deliberate exhale, impossibly deep and resonant, coming from the shadows around her. It wasn't her breath. It wasn't human. Isla froze, her heart hammering in her chest as the sound grew louder, closer. The darkness seemed to press in around her, alive with unseen movement. Whatever she had awakened, whatever she had unlocked, it was no longer confined to the depths of the house, and it was coming for her. Chapter 7. The Mirror's Silent Truth. The darkness felt alive. It pressed against Isla, an entity all its own, pulsing and undulating with a rhythm that seemed to mock her frantic heartbeat. She was frozen, her body a trembling vessel of terror as the exhalation, a deep, guttural sound that felt more like a vibration in her bones, continued to echo through the cavernous space. Whatever had been summoned from the depths of the house was now here with her, unseen yet impossibly close. The sound of movement began to rise from the shadows, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. It was the sound of footsteps, uneven and heavy, as though something massive was dragging itself across the stone floor. Isla's breath came in shallow gasps, the air around her too thick to fill her lungs. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, an oppressive weight in the darkness that bore down on her, watching, waiting. She clutched her lantern, its weak flame barely flickering against the overwhelming blackness, and took a step back. The sound of footsteps stopped abruptly. She froze, her entire body tense as the silence returned, even heavier than before. The absence of sound was deafening, an unnatural void that seemed to suck the very life out of the air. Her pulse thundered in her ears, the only noise in a world that had otherwise fallen eerily still. Then, the footsteps resumed, closer now. Isla's legs finally obeyed her, and she stumbled backward, the lantern swinging wildly in her hand. The light caught on something in the darkness, a faint glimmer of movement, a shape too distorted to comprehend. It wasn't human. Its form was massive yet insubstantial, shifting and bending as though made of smoke and shadow. She turned and ran, her feet slamming against the stone floor as she fled blindly through the dark. The air seemed to resist her movements, thick and cloying, as though the house itself sought to trap her. The footsteps behind her grew louder, faster, matching her frantic pace with ease. The golden light that had once filled the room was gone, leaving her with only the flickering lantern to guide her. The symbols on the walls had dimmed to a faint, intermittent glow, their once steady pulse now erratic and weak. Isla's mind raced as she ran, trying to make sense of what she had unleashed. The passageways twisted and turned, each corner leading her deeper into the labyrinth of the house. It no longer felt like the cellar. It felt endless, a maze designed to disorient and trap her. The walls seemed to close in as she ran, their surfaces cold and damp, slick with some unknown substance that made her stumble. The footsteps behind her grew louder still, a relentless pursuit that sent waves of panic crashing over her. She didn't dare look back, the fear of what she might see more paralyzing than the unknown. Her legs burned with exertion, her breaths coming in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Finally, she saw it. A faint glow ahead, weak and flickering but unmistakable. It was a doorway, its edges lined with the same strange symbols that had adorned the walls. The light spilling from it was cold and pale, unlike the warm gold that had previously guided her. It felt like a trap, but it was her only chance. She hurled herself through the doorway, collapsing onto the cold stone floor on the other side. The moment she crossed the threshold, The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, so sudden and complete that it left her ears ringing. Isla scrambled to her feet, turning to face the doorway. The passage behind her was gone. In its place was a smooth, unbroken wall of stone, as though the door had never existed. She was trapped. The room she now found herself in was small and circular, the walls lined with shelves filled with strange, ancient artifacts. Dust-covered books with spines of cracked leather sat alongside jars filled with murky liquids and unidentifiable objects. The pale light emanated from a crystal embedded in the ceiling, its glow steady and unnatural. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface smooth and black like the altar she had seen before. On the pedestal rested a single object, a mirror. It was small and round, framed in silver that gleamed faintly in the dim light. The glass was unerringly clear, reflecting the room with perfect clarity. But as Isla stepped closer, she noticed something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't moving. It stood perfectly still, staring back at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Isla's breath caught in her throat as the reflection's expression began to change, its mouth curling into a slow, deliberate smile. The smile grew wider and wider, stretching across its face until it no longer resembled her at all. The mirror began to tremble, its surface rippling like water. Isla took a step back, but her reflection remained in place, its dark, hollow eyes locked onto hers. The air in the room grew colder, the pale light from the crystal dimming as the shadows crept closer. Then, the reflection moved. It pressed its hands against the inside of the glass, its distorted fingers leaving smudges on the pristine surface. The mirror shook violently, the silver frame cracking as the figure inside began to push against its boundaries. Isla turned and ran, but the room offered no escape. The shelves lined the walls with no visible openings, the stone unbroken and seamless. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent, their voices rising in a chaotic crescendo that filled the room. The mirror shattered with an ear-splitting crash, and the light from the crystal extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. Isla's scream was swallowed by the shadows, her voice lost in the abyss. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the footsteps resumed. Chapter 8. Steps in the empty hallway. The silence after the footsteps began again was suffocating. It wasn't a peaceful stillness but an oppressive void, the kind that seeps into the soul and twists the nerves. Isla's chest heaved as she pressed herself against the cold stone wall. The shattered fragments of the mirror scattered around her like shards of frozen light. She didn't dare move, every muscle locked in a frozen tableau of fear, her pulse racing in her ears like a drumbeat heralding doom. The footsteps echoed softly, deliberate and slow, reverberating through the chamber. They didn't come from any single direction but seemed to circle her, growing closer and then retreating, as though the unseen entity was toying with her. The walls of the room seemed alive now, the shelves bending and warping, the objects upon them rattling faintly as though reacting to the vibrations of her terror. The pale crystal light above her flickered back to life, but it was dimmer than before, casting strange, uneven shadows across the chamber. Isla's eyes darted toward the shattered mirror. Its frame lay twisted and broken, but the surface of the glass still shimmered faintly, rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond. For a moment, she thought she saw a face reflected in the shards. Not her own, but something darker, more malevolent, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her. She turned away, unwilling to confront whatever had been trapped within the mirror. Her thoughts raced, frantic and disjointed, searching for an escape. The walls closed in around her, narrowing the space as though the house itself had become a sentient thing, reshaping its interior to trap her. She clutched the lantern tightly, its dim light the only thing standing between her and total darkness. The whispers began again, faint and insidious, threading through the air like a venomous mist. They didn't come from the walls this time, but from within her own mind, weaving through her thoughts like a parasite. Words she didn't understand filled her head, their cadence rhythmic and hypnotic, lulling her into a haze that dulled her senses and blurred the edges of reality. Suddenly, the wall behind her gave way. She tumbled backward into a new corridor, the stone beneath her hands icy and damp. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of decay and something older, more primal. She scrambled to her feet, her lantern casting flickering light over the passageway. The walls here were different, no longer smooth stone but rough, jagged rock covered in deep, claw-like gouges. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, a labyrinth of shadow and stone that seemed to twist upon itself. Isla hesitated, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The whispers were louder now, resonating through the walls and floor, merging with the faint, rhythmic pulse of the house's heartbeat. She couldn't tell where they were leading her, or if they were meant to mislead her entirely. She chose a direction at random and began to walk, her footsteps hesitant and quiet. The walls seemed to shift around her, the gouges in their surface deepening into patterns that almost resembled runes or symbols. Her lantern's light played tricks on her eyes, casting fleeting shapes in the shadows that always vanished when she turned her head. The passage widened into a larger chamber, and Isla stopped in her tracks. The space before her was dominated by a mural that covered the entire wall. It was ancient and crude, painted in thick, uneven strokes of what appeared to be blood. The figures in the mural were twisted and grotesque, their bodies contorted into unnatural poses as they writhed and reached toward a central figure. The central figure was massive, its shape vague and amorphous, but its presence was unmistakably powerful. Its many limbs extended outward, grasping at the smaller figures, drawing them into its body. Isla's stomach turned as she realized the smaller figures weren't simply being consumed. They were being transformed, their forms melting and merging with the central mass. Her gaze was drawn to the base of the mural, where a single phrase was scrawled in jagged, angular script. It wasn't a language she recognized, but the meaning was clear in her mind. All are one. All return to the shadow. A chill ran through her, colder than the air around her. She turned to leave the chamber, but the passage she had entered through was gone. In its place was a smooth wall, its surface unmarred by any opening. She spun around, searching for another way out, but the chamber offered no escape. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound that drowned out her thoughts. The lantern's flame flickered and dimmed, casting the room in a wavering half-light. The mural began to change before her eyes, the painted figures writhing and shifting, their movements jerky and unnatural. The central figure in the mural seemed to swell, its limbs extending beyond the confines of the wall. The paint bubbled and cracked, oozing down the surface like fresh blood as the figure's limbs reached toward her. Isla stumbled backward, the lantern slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The light went out. Darkness enveloped her, absolute and unyielding. The air was thick and suffocating, pressing against her chest as the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. She felt the walls closing in, the space around her shrinking as the shadow reached for her. In the darkness, a single light appeared. It was faint and distant, a flickering pinprick in the void that seemed to beckon her. She stumbled toward it, her hands outstretched, her legs weak and trembling. The light grew brighter as she approached, resolving into the shape of a doorway. She stepped through without hesitation, desperate to escape the suffocating chamber. The moment she crossed the threshold, the whispers ceased, and the oppressive weight lifted from her chest. She found herself in a new room, its walls smooth and unmarked, its air still and silent. A single object rested in the center of the room, a small, intricately carved box, its surface adorned with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. The box was locked, its lid held shut by a silver clasp. Beside it lay an envelope, its surface blank except for a single word written in dark, spidery script. Open. Isla's hand trembled as she reached for the box, her mind screaming at her to stop. But the house had claimed her now, and there was no turning back. Chapter 9. The Scent of Burning Lilies. The box seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its carvings shifting ever so slightly beneath her touch as Isla ran her fingers over the smooth surface. The symbols etched into it were familiar, yet foreign, their meaning just out of reach, as if they were part of a language she had once known but had since forgotten. The sensation of recognition unsettled her, a whisper in the recesses of her mind urging her to heed a warning she couldn't quite remember. The silver clasp on the box was cold against her skin, its sharp edges digging into her fingers as she slowly, cautiously, unlatched it. The box did not open immediately. Instead, a low, reverberating hum filled the air, as though the very house was holding its breath. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, thickening around the box, pulling inward toward the object like a hungry animal. Isla hesitated. Her heart raced, the quiet thrum of her pulse drowning out the faint hum. The box felt heavy in her hands, not in weight but in its promise, its potential for danger. She should have left it. She should have walked away and never looked back. But there was something in her, something ancient and compulsive, that refused to let her turn away now. With a final, trembling exhale, she opened the box. Inside was not an object, but a key, an ornate thing, gleaming faintly in the dim light. Its metal was blackened and etched with intricate, spiraling designs, like some forgotten sigil meant to unlock more than mere doors. It felt wrong, as though it belonged to a world that should never have existed, its power vibrating through the air with a sickly energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The key was not alone. Beneath it lay a single sheet of paper, crisp and worn at the edges, its surface bearing the same spidery script that had adorned the envelope. Isla unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the words, though they seemed to twist and distort before her eyes. It was a list. The 3 keys, it read. The first unlocks the heart. The second unlocks the mind. The third unlocks the soul. The words lingered in her mind like an echo, their meaning slipping away like water through her fingers. What heart? What mind? What soul? She didn't understand. The house didn't want her to understand. The house wanted her to follow, to accept its terms, to become a part of it, just as everything else had before her. A sound shattered the stillness. A sharp, cracking noise like bones snapping in the distance, followed by a series of soft, unsteady thuds. The footsteps were back, more erratic than before, their rhythm broken and uneven, as though something larger and more dangerous was moving within the house. Isla's heart skipped a beat. She snapped the box shut, the key slipping from her fingers as she grabbed it and stuffed it back inside. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. The shadows, thick and oppressive, coiled around her ankles, dragging her back as the footsteps grew louder, closer. The walls seemed to hum, the space around her trembling as though the house itself was coming alive. The door behind her, the one she had come through, was gone. In its place was a wall of shifting stone, its surface slick and unyielding. Panic surged through her chest as the room grew darker, the once flickering light from the crystal above her fading until only a faint glow remained, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a mind of their own. The whispers were louder now, not the same soft murmur she had heard before, but a cacophony of voices, speaking in unison, 1,000 different tongues twisting together. She couldn't understand them, couldn't even make sense of their words. But the urgency in their tone was unmistakable. They were warning her. She had to leave. But how? Her eyes darted around the room, seeking any escape. The walls were solid, the space between them too narrow to move, and the floor had begun to tremble beneath her feet. The house was shifting again, and Isla realized that no matter how far she ran, no matter how desperately she tried to escape, the house would never let her go. Her hand reached for the key once more, her fingers trembling as she pulled it from the box. It felt hot now, burning against her skin, as though it had absorbed the heat of the house's fury. She gripped it tightly, feeling the sharp, cold edges of the ornate designs digging into her palm. The house wanted her to use it. The moment she touched the key to the wall, the air around her changed. A low, grinding noise echoed through the chamber, reverberating through the very bones of the house. The floor beneath her feet cracked open, and the wall she had been staring at began to shift, revealing a narrow passageway. A new sound filled the air. It was a voice, deep, guttural, but unmistakably human. It seemed to be coming from the darkness beyond the passage, a voice full of agony and despair. The whispers rose in volume, their frantic tone urging her to flee, to turn away, but Isla couldn't. The door had opened. The passage was there, and it called to her. She knew she had no choice but to go. She stepped forward. The passage was narrow, the air thick with the smell of rot and decay. Her lantern's flame flickered uncertainly as she moved through the dark corridor, the light casting long, distorted shadows on the stone walls. The whispers were everywhere now, louder and more insistent, though the voice that had spoken earlier was now silent. She moved forward, each step feeling like a surrender, the key gripped tightly in her hand. The walls around her seemed to shift, bending inward, narrowing the path. She pressed on, her heart pounding as she passed deeper into the winding labyrinth of the house, not sure whether she was following the path toward freedom or to something much worse. The shadows were closing in, the weight of them pressing against her as the passageway stretched into an endless tunnel. And somewhere, deep within the walls, she could hear it, the slow, steady rhythm of footsteps. The thing was following her, and now, more than ever, she knew that the house itself was watching. Chapter 10. Figures in the Moonlight. The passage twisted and bent like the serpentine intestines of some great beast. The stone walls, once smooth, now seemed to writhe, veins of dark moisture running along their surfaces, pulsing with an eerie life. The lantern's flame barely held on against the oppressive darkness, its light flickering in the heavy air, casting fleeting shadows that danced unnaturally across the floor. Isla walked forward, her footsteps hesitant but driven by an instinct that told her to keep moving no matter how unnatural the world around her seemed to become. Her heart raced, and though she had felt fear since she first set foot in the house, it was now a deeper, primal terror, a cold, suffocating dread that seemed to tighten with every step. The air was thick and musty, clinging to her skin, and the further she moved, the more it felt like the walls themselves were drawing closer, the space around her closing in. The house felt alive now, its pulse not just in the walls, but in the air itself, as though something vast and ancient had begun to awaken beneath her feet. The path seemed to stretch on endlessly, no clear end in sight. She had lost track of time, and it seemed as if the passage had been here all along, waiting for her. The strange hum she had first heard when she opened the box had returned, low and rhythmic, vibrating through the stone like the heartbeat of some great creature hidden deep within the bowels of the house. At one point, she stumbled over something soft, and her lantern tilted dangerously in her hand. She steadied it quickly, catching a glimpse of what had caused her to trip. A torn, decayed fabric, hanging loosely from the floor like a rug, though it was too tattered to be of any use. She bent down and touched it with trembling fingers. The fabric was cold to the touch, damp and frayed, its edges darkened by a substance she couldn't identify. Isla's stomach churned, and she pulled away from it quickly, standing up to continue forward. Her mind was reeling. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn further into the house, deeper and deeper into its heart. The walls began to shift again. She felt the subtle, almost imperceptible trembling beneath her feet as the stone seemed to groan and settle, its edges grinding like the teeth of an old, sleeping beast awakening from a centuries-long slumber. There was a low, undulating sound that seemed to echo from the depth of the passage, a guttural, growling murmur that sent a fresh wave of cold panic through her veins. It wasn't a sound she could place, more like the distant rumblings of something far away, something alive. The air thickened with the stench of rot, of earth and decay, and Isla gagged as the scent grew stronger. It was as if the house itself had been festering, brewing something deep beneath the earth, something long forgotten. The closer she got, the more suffocating the smell became, until it overwhelmed her senses completely, filling her lungs and throat. Then, suddenly, the path ahead opened. It wasn't a door that appeared, no handle or threshold to cross. The stone simply melted away, revealing a vast, open space. The chamber stretched out before her like some great, cavernous void, its ceiling lost in the blackness above. The lantern's light barely reached across the distance, but Isla could feel the weight of the room, its oppressive presence pressing in from all sides. There was a sense of ancient power here, something old, something that had been waiting for her. The walls of the chamber were lined with shelves, their surfaces cluttered with relics she couldn't begin to comprehend. Skulls, bones, twisted metal artifacts, their shapes distorted and unnatural. Strange, translucent jars filled with dark liquids, their contents swirling like smoke within. The shelves seemed to stretch upward impossibly high, and in the farthest corner of the room, a large altar loomed, draped in dark, heavy cloths. A single object rested atop the altar, an ornate stone heart. It was large, perhaps the size of a man's fist, dark and smooth, pulsing faintly with an internal light that seemed to hum in tune with the low vibrations that reverberated through the chamber. Isla could feel the pulse of it deep in her chest, as though her own heart was beating in sync with the stone. She felt drawn to it, compelled, as though it called to her. It was the heart of the house, she realized, the heart that had been feeding off the fear, the souls that had come before her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stepped forward, each movement feeling like a weight that pressed down upon her. She could hear the whispers again, louder now, swirling around her in a maddening chorus of voices, some familiar, others alien and strange. She could feel their eyes upon her, all of them watching her every move. Without thinking, she reached out for the stone heart. The moment her fingers brushed against its surface, the room seemed to shift violently. The shadows in the corners of the chamber grew darker, more solid, as if they were stretching toward her, eager to consume her. The walls seemed to tremble with a power that had been dormant for centuries. And then, silence. The pulse of the heart was gone. The whispers faded. The chamber fell into an unbearable stillness. Isla's heart raced as she pulled her hand away, staring at the stone. It had gone cold. The faint glow that had filled it had disappeared, leaving it as a mere object, a hollow reminder of what had once been. But even as the power in the room faded, a deep, throbbing sensation remained, something pulling at the edges of her consciousness. The house was alive, and she had touched its heart. Something stirred deep within the walls. A low rumble. Isla stepped back, her mind spinning, her body trembling. She had known, in some deep, primal way, that touching the heart would change things. But she hadn't realized it would do this. The house was waking up now, truly waking, and the walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing more solid, the air heavier, as if the very atmosphere had become a choking presence. It was no longer just the house. It was something else now, something that had been awakened and was moving beneath the surface, something ancient, hungry, and bound to the house itself. Isla turned, but the passageway she had entered from had disappeared. She was alone, trapped within the heart of the house, the stone heart pulsing at the altar like the center of some great, living thing. And now, she realized, the house had marked her as its own. Her only choice was to keep moving, to find the next piece of the puzzle, to escape whatever was coming for her. But the shadows had already begun to move again, and they were closing in faster than she could run. Chapter 11. The Portrait That Watches. Isla's pulse pounded in her ears as she stood in the center of the chamber, her eyes darting from the now cold heart on the altar to the walls, which seemed to close in around her with every breath. The shadows that once clung to the corners of the room had shifted, stretching out like tendrils, coiling around the air itself. They seemed to move in rhythm with the pulse of the house, a slow, deliberate advance that made the very space feel alive, suffocating. The air had thickened, turning oppressive, as though the atmosphere had been poisoned by something ancient and insatiable. The heartbeat of the house had become louder now, more distinct, as though it reverberated not only through the stone but within her chest. Each thump seemed to carry with it a weight, heavy, powerful, and relentless. It was as if the walls were alive with this pulse, the house breathing, exhaling with a rhythmic certainty, preparing for something. Something that would come for her if she stayed still for too long. She had to move. Isla's legs felt like lead, yet her body acted on instinct, her feet carrying her through the chamber even as her mind struggled to keep up. The shadows clung to the edges of her vision, twisting in the periphery, their presence undeniable. They were not mere absence of light. No, these shadows were something else entirely. They were watching her, waiting. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift as she took each step, as if the ground itself was unsettled by her movements, questioning her right to be there. Every crack of her footfall echoed too loudly, reverberating in the still air as though the entire house was listening. Listening for what? For a mistake? A misstep that would give away her position, her vulnerability? Suddenly, the lantern flickered violently, its flame shrinking to almost nothing, casting the room into near darkness. She moved faster, desperate to keep the light, but the darkness pressed closer, alive, breathing down her neck as the shadows stretched toward her like unseen hands. Her own shadow seemed to elongate unnaturally, twisting along the walls in grotesque shapes, as though it were trying to separate from her, to become something else. A scraping sound filled the air, low, like the dragging of metal against stone. It wasn't a sound she could ignore, but neither could she turn toward it. The noise grew louder, closer, scraping against the walls, the floor, and then something worse. A soft, heavy thud, like the step of something too large, too monstrous to be contained within these walls. Isla froze. She couldn't see it. She couldn't feel it in the way she knew she should, but it was there. Something massive, something that had emerged from the heart of the house, born from the shadows. It was waiting, watching. Her breath caught in her throat as she continued to move, one step, then another. The shadows twisted and writhed, pooling on the floor around her, and the scraping noise grew louder still, moving closer. The walls seemed to pulse with the same rhythm, as if they were anticipating something, urging her toward the center of the room, toward the altar that had brought all of this to life. She turned her head just in time to see a shadow move unnaturally in the corner of her eye. There was something there, something large and twisted, a shape too strange to comprehend, too horrible to focus on for long. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken form, the darkness bleeding into something that was no longer just a void but a creature, a being that had been born of this place. The scraping stopped, the thudding ceased, and in that silence, Isla realized the thing was no longer moving. It had already found her. Her heartbeat seemed to stop altogether. The shadows around her shifted once again, slowly, deliberately, as though the house itself was folding in on her, its walls tightening around her body, its cold hands reaching for her with invisible claws. The space between her and the exit, the hallway she had come through, had grown impossibly long. The air was thick, choking, the very walls pulsing with the rhythmic thump of the house's heart. The thing in the shadows moved again. This time, it was faster. The scrape of metal against stone filled the silence, growing louder as it dragged closer. The sound reverberated through her body like a physical blow. She turned, a sudden burst of adrenaline flooding her veins. She couldn't see it yet, but she knew it was there, its presence as tangible as the very walls of the house. It was not just a creature of the darkness. It was the darkness itself, birthed from the house's insatiable hunger. She had to escape. Isla's legs trembled beneath her as she pushed forward, each step feeling as though the house were dragging her back, as though the shadows themselves had taken root in her skin, clinging to her, weighing her down. The pressure of it all was suffocating. The air, thick with the smell of rot and decay, seemed to close around her lungs, each breath more difficult to take. The walls seemed to bend, the ceiling narrowing as she moved, the very house trying to squeeze her into its depths. A dark shape flickered in the corner of her eye. She felt it then, the cold breath of something against her neck, its presence no longer just a whisper but a tangible weight pressing against her. A jagged, metallic sound scraped along her back. She turned, but there was nothing there. The shadows had retreated again, leaving only the eerie quiet. But that wasn't a relief. The silence was worse. The stillness felt wrong. It was as if the house was preparing for something, waiting for her to make the next move. She had to keep moving. With trembling hands, Isla grabbed hold of the stone wall, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingertips. The lantern still flickered weakly in her other hand, casting an irregular light that made the shadows around her seem to stretch even further. She didn't dare stop, even as the house seemed to pulse with renewed urgency. It was closing in on her, pulling her back toward the altar. She had touched the heart, and now it was coming for her. The passage behind her had disappeared again, leaving no trace of the path she had taken. The walls, now slick with some viscous substance, seemed to move with her, guiding her toward the heart of the house, as though the house itself were drawing her in, urging her to take that final step into its embrace. Something was coming. Isla didn't know if it was the house, the shadows, or something worse. She only knew that there was no escape. The darkness had already wrapped its fingers around her heart, and there was no turning back. Chapter 12. Crawling Beyond the Walls. The walls seemed to collapse inward with every passing second. Isla's breath was shallow, her chest tight as the house. No, the entire world around her seemed to fold in on itself. The lantern flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows against the stone walls that felt as though they were alive, pulsing, breathing in unison with the ever-quickening beat of the house's heart. Each thud echoed in her bones, resonating with the deep, unrelenting hum that had filled the air since her first steps into this place. The ground beneath her feet trembled as though the earth itself was not solid, but a living thing, shifting, stretching, eager to swallow her whole. The very stone seemed to breathe, its cracks and crevices widening, opening like a mouth in the dark. She had to keep moving, but every step felt like an eternity, the path stretching endlessly ahead, bending and warping in ways that defied reason. The once clear passageways had dissolved into a nightmarish maze of shifting walls and oppressive, suffocating air. Every time she thought she had found a way out, the house closed in, blocking her from every direction. The shadows were no longer just a presence lurking in the corners of the room. They had taken shape, moved from the periphery of her vision into solid, twisting forms that crawled along the walls, coiled around the edges of the lantern's weak light. They stretched out, long and serpentine, their forms ever-changing, as though they were evolving before her eyes. Some resembled limbs, skeletal, elongated arms reaching for her. Others twisted into indistinct shapes, faces and bodies appearing in their wake only to melt back into the void. Isla tried to scream, but the sound was stolen from her throat. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The air itself seemed to have become thick with dread, as though the house had absorbed every ounce of her strength, every breath, leaving her powerless and mute. The shadows were everywhere now, no longer confined to the edges of the room, but swirling around her like a storm, pressing against her body, their coldness seeping into her skin. It was as though they were alive, and they wanted something from her, something she couldn't understand but felt deep in her bones. They tugged at her, pulling her in every direction, trying to separate her from herself. She stumbled, her feet slipping on the slick stone floor, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her gaze darted toward the farthest corner of the chamber. There, standing in the blackest part of the room, was a shape. It was larger than anything she had seen before. Its outline vague, shifting, its form too massive to comprehend. She could not make out its features, but she could feel its presence like a weight pressing against her chest. It was darker than the shadows that clung to the walls. It was the embodiment of the void itself, ancient and hungry, waiting for her to fall into its grasp. The scraping sound returned, louder now, vibrating the very air around her. The sound of something monstrous dragging itself along the floor, growing closer, louder with each passing moment. A presence so powerful that the very fabric of reality seemed to tremble in its wake. The ground beneath her feet gave way. The floor cracked open as if the earth itself was splitting apart, and she was caught in the violent rift between reality and the abyss. She fell, her body weightless, plunging into a dark, infinite chasm that opened wide beneath her. Time lost all meaning. The fall was endless, each second stretching into eternity. The walls of the house had ceased to exist, and she was floating in pure darkness, weightless, unable to grasp onto anything. The only sound that remained was the pulsating heartbeat of the house, the unyielding rhythm that had guided her every move from the moment she stepped inside. Then, she hit something, soft, like a cushion, though it was not the ground. A cold, damp substance clung to her body as she landed with a jolt, her limbs sprawling as she gasped for breath. She blinked into the dark, her vision still blurred, the world spinning in ways that defied all logic. It felt as though she had fallen into the belly of the house itself, deeper than she could have imagined. The space around her was vast, its boundaries unrecognizable, as though the very fabric of reality had warped into something beyond understanding. And yet, as her eyes adjusted to the dark, she could see them, the shadows. They were everywhere, but they were not just figments of darkness now. They were tangible, solidified, their forms taking shape and shape again, flowing around her like liquid, pressing against her skin like a living mass of dread. They whispered, though she could not hear their voices, only feel them skittering across her body, crawling over her like a swarm. The air was thick with their presence, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. She stood, trembling, as the walls seemed to close in again. The room was no longer just an empty space. It had become something else, something far worse. The pulse of the house's heart reverberated through the air like a drum, so loud that it rattled her bones. And in the distance, she saw it, the altar, the heart of the house, still pulsing, still waiting for her to claim it. But now, as she approached, she could feel the pull of the shadows growing stronger. They swarmed around her feet, their cold fingers curling around her ankles, pulling her toward the altar. It was as though the house was speaking to her in a language beyond comprehension, urging her forward with every beat of its heart. The altar was no longer just a place. It was the center of this place, the source of all that had been set in motion. The heart on the altar glowed faintly, but the light was wrong. It was not warm but cold, as though the light itself was the manifestation of something far older and darker than the house itself. As she drew closer, the shadows around her seemed to open up, revealing something buried beneath them. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and she felt a deep rumble emanating from the very heart of the house. The pulse of its heart grew stronger, louder, its rhythm matching her own. And then, she realized, it wasn't just the house, the heart, the shadows, the pulse. It was all one. It was alive, and it was feeding on her. The shadows had taken root inside her, their whispers seeping into her very soul. And now, they were pulling her into the darkness, dragging her toward the altar, toward the heart that had called her here. It was no longer just a house. It was a prison, a tomb, and a nightmare. It was the place where souls went to vanish, to be consumed, to disappear into the abyss. And Isla was no longer its guest. She was its final sacrifice. Her body felt heavy, as though the very darkness was trying to consume her whole. The shadows reached for her, wrapping around her, squeezing her, pulling her into the heart of the house, into the void where everything vanished. The darkness swallowed her whole, and in the silence, the pulse of the house continued to beat. Chapter 13. The Basement of Lost Time. Time lost all meaning in the depths of the house. What had once been familiar, walls, floors, ceilings, had warped into something unrecognizable, shifting in shape and form, a nightmare whose very dimensions could not be grasped by the mind. Isla's limbs felt sluggish, heavy as though they were tethered to the very foundations of the house. The shadows clung to her skin, their cold fingers digging into her body, their weight pushing her deeper into the heart of the dark abyss that seemed to consume everything in its path. The heart still pulsed in the distance, though its beat had slowed, its rhythm almost mournful, as though it had grown tired of the game it had been playing with her. Or perhaps, Isla thought with a shiver that ran down her spine, it was simply savoring the final moments before her descent into oblivion. She had no sense of direction anymore, no awareness of whether she was moving forward or simply floating in place. The darkness had swallowed everything. Her thoughts, her will to escape, even the sense of her own body. Yet, through it all, she could still feel it, the heartbeat of the house. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, one that seemed to press down on her soul itself. Each pulse reverberated through her chest, vibrating through her bones as though the house were a living creature, feeding off her fear, her pain, her essence. It was not a place she had walked into. It was a thing, something that had been waiting for her, for years perhaps, for generations. Isla could feel its hunger, its insatiable need to consume. And the closer she got to the heart of the house, the more her own heartbeat seemed to mirror its rhythm. A pulse of despair that throbbed in her chest, matching the dark pulse that surrounded her, echoing in her very soul. The floor beneath her feet buckled and cracked, as though it too was feeling the strain, the pressure of something far deeper beneath the surface. A tremor ran through the walls, rippling the air, sending waves of oppressive force through the space around her. Her vision swam as the darkness thickened, and the shadows pressed closer, as though they were trying to enfold her completely, drowning her in their weight. But then, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a brief flicker of light through the thick shadows, something that caught her attention. A pulse of energy, a strange, distant warmth that seemed to cut through the suffocating cold. The light was faint, like a dying star, and it pulsed in time with the beat of the house. At first, Isla could not tell whether it was a trick of the darkness, a fleeting illusion. But no, it was real. She reached for it instinctively, the small flicker of light drawing her in as if it were the last lifeline in an ocean of despair. Her body moved, each step sluggish, each movement heavy, but the pull of the light was undeniable. The shadows recoiled for a brief moment, almost as if they feared the light's presence. And in that moment, Isla understood. This light, this flicker of warmth, was not a force of the house. It was something else, something pure, a part of her own soul, perhaps, fighting against the darkness that had claimed her. The walls trembled again, more violently this time. The heart of the house pulsed faster, a deafening rhythm that shook the very core of the space. The air was charged, crackling with an energy that both terrified and invigorated her. It was as though the house itself was responding to the presence of the light, shifting, recoiling, as if it were afraid of what it might lose. Isla's feet slid against the slick stone floor as she moved toward the light, her body shaking with exhaustion, but her will to reach it was stronger than any physical limitation. It was the only thing that could save her. She reached out with trembling hands, and just as her fingers brushed the light, the house roared in protest. The walls screamed, the shadows screeched, their cries melding together into a cacophony of madness, a torrent of sound that rattled her bones and filled her ears with an overwhelming pressure. The light flickered wildly, struggling against the onslaught of darkness, but it was growing stronger, its glow intensifying with every passing second. And then, just as it seemed like the shadows might devour the last vestiges of the light, it exploded. Isla was thrown backward by the force, her body crashing into the wall with such intensity that for a moment, she feared her spine might snap. The world spun around her as she lay there, breathless, gasping for air. The light had shattered the silence, but now, the shadows were retreating, shrinking back into the corners of the room. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, though it lingered, just beneath the surface, as though the darkness was waiting for something, waiting for her to make a mistake. The heart still pulsed, but now, its rhythm had changed. The beat was no longer heavy with hunger, no longer oppressive. It was slower, faint, as though the house had been wounded, its strength waning. The house, the thing that had called her here, was weakening. Isla pulled herself to her feet, her legs trembling, but a strange sense of clarity washed over her. She wasn't sure how much time had passed or if she was still even in the same place, but something had shifted. The darkness was no longer invincible. It was as if the house had underestimated her, as though it had believed she would succumb to its will without a fight. But Isla had fought, even if she had not realized it at first. The walls groaned. The ground beneath her feet trembled again. But this time it wasn't a warning. It was something else, something deeper, more profound. The very foundation of the house seemed to quake, as though it were trying to hold itself together. But the effort was growing more desperate, more frantic. Isla took a step forward, and then another. The shadows still shifted, but they no longer pressed in on her, no longer sought to pull her into their cold embrace. For the first time since entering this place, the air felt lighter, as though she had gained some measure of control over the house, over the darkness that had held her captive. She stepped forward, closer to the pulsing heart at the center of the room. The house groaned in protest, the pulse of its heart faltering for a brief moment. And in that moment, Isla understood. The heart of the house was not just a source of power. It was a cage, and she was the key. With one final, deliberate step, she reached the altar, her fingers brushing against the cold stone. The moment her hand made contact, the pulse of the house came to a sudden halt. The heart, still warm beneath her fingertips, began to beat erratically, as though it were dying. The air around her thickened, swirling, and for the briefest of moments, Isla felt herself caught in the current of darkness again. But she refused to be consumed. She had come too far. As the heart of the house began to crumble, the shadows shrank away, dissipating into the very air. The walls of the chamber cracked and splintered, their structure collapsing like the last breath of a dying beast. The pulse slowed, its heartbeat fading, until it was gone entirely, leaving only silence in its wake. And as the darkness receded, the light that had once been swallowed by the shadows returned. Isla stood alone in the center of the room, the house now silent, its hunger stilled. The heart was still in her hand, but its pulse had ceased. The shadows, no longer alive, no longer threatening, had dissipated entirely. The air was still heavy, but the weight that had pressed down on her heart was gone. She had survived, but what had she truly escaped? And what had the house given her in return? Chapter 14. A House That Never Sleeps. The quiet in the aftermath was deafening. It was a silence that consumed the space, reverberating in Isla's ears, filling the void where the pulsing heartbeat of the house once resided. The shadows had melted away like ink in water, their oppressive presence now nothing more than a fading memory. The walls, once trembling with a dark energy, stood still and unmoving. The weight that had pressed so heavily on her soul had lifted, leaving nothing but an empty hollow. Isla stood alone, her hand still clutching the remnants of the house's heart, its warmth now entirely drained, its power extinguished. The room around her was in ruins, cracks spiderwebbed across the stone walls, the ceiling sagging under the strain of the house's collapse. Yet there was an eerie stillness to it all. The violent tremors had stopped. The air, once thick with malevolent intent, now hung with a heavy quiet, as though the house itself had finally exhaled its last breath. She was free, but the thought didn't bring her the relief she expected. The silence was unnerving, an absence that felt more unsettling than the dark pressure that had consumed her for so long. She looked around, her senses sharp, as though waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the shadows to return, or for the house to awaken once more. But nothing came. Isla took a tentative step forward. Her feet seemed to sink into the dust-covered floor, the weight of the stone beneath her feet somehow different now, as if the foundations had shifted. The room, though damaged, still stood as it had before, imposing, dark, and ancient. Yet something had changed. The walls no longer whispered their dark promises to her. The floor no longer creaked with life beneath her steps. It was as if the house had exhausted its last breath, giving up its fight to keep her within its grasp. But she had felt that, hadn't she? The shift. The feeling that something had broken when the heart of the house had ceased its pulse. She had sensed it in her bones. Something was gone. Something integral had been severed. The air was lighter, but it was not the lightness of freedom. It was the lightness of an absence, of something that had been pulled from the very fabric of existence. The house was no longer alive. She moved cautiously through the room, her eyes scanning the ruins. The once grand walls were now nothing more than fractured remnants, their surfaces crumbling under the weight of their own age. It was clear that the house had been old, ancient in a way that defied understanding. But now, it felt hollow, drained of its essence. There was no pulse to guide her steps, no oppressive weight to drive her forward. And yet, despite the apparent stillness, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not by the house, not by any physical presence, but by something far deeper. A feeling that clung to the air itself, thick and suffocating. Like the very silence was a presence waiting to claim her. She knew what it was. It was the void, the absence of the house's heartbeat. The place that had once held her captive was now empty, but that emptiness was just as terrifying as the darkness that had once consumed her. Isla's fingers grazed the walls as she moved, the cold stone sending a shiver up her spine. The ruins around her felt like a mausoleum, still, desolate, and heavy with an unseen weight. She could feel the remnants of the house's power pulsing faintly beneath the surface, as though the structure itself was unwilling to let go of its past, unwilling to accept its own demise. The echo of the heart's pulse was gone, but something remained in its place, a lingering, oppressive force that seemed to watch her with 1,000 unseen eyes. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached the center of the room, where the altar had once stood. The stone was cracked, shattered in places, but beneath the rubble, the faintest trace of something still lingered. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the cold, jagged edges of the broken altar. There, amidst the ruin, something glinted faintly, a shard of something once whole, something that had once been part of the house's heart. Isla's heart skipped a beat as she reached for it, her fingers trembling with hesitation. The shard was small, no bigger than the size of her palm, but its presence felt alive. Even in the face of the house's ruin, it carried a strange, pulsing energy, one that resonated with the depths of her soul. She could feel it, as though it were calling to her, its energy pulling her in. But she hesitated. Her mind raced. What if this was not the end? What if the house was not truly defeated? What if it had only been waiting for her to make this very mistake, to reach for the remnants of its power, to stir it back into life? She could already feel the pulse of the shard in her fingers, faint but unmistakable. The shadows were gone, yes, but there was still something in the air. A lingering presence that whispered of things unseen, of forces beyond her understanding. Isla looked around the room, the quiet stretching out in all directions. The shadows were no longer tangible, but they remained. The house may have fallen silent, but the essence of it still lingered, like a ghost that refused to leave. She turned the shard over in her hand, feeling its cool surface, its jagged edges biting into her skin. For a moment, she thought she could hear something beneath the silence, a low hum, a vibration deep in her chest, as though the house itself were still alive in some way. It was as if the pulse had never truly stopped, only hidden itself, waiting for the right moment to strike. The thought struck her like a bolt of lightning. She realized then, with sudden clarity, that the house had never been alive in the way she had assumed. The house itself was a shell, a vessel that contained something far older, far more powerful. And when she had broken its heart, she had not destroyed the thing that had controlled it. She had only freed it. The silence now felt like a trap, an illusion that would soon be shattered. She could feel the presence of something far darker moving in the depths of her mind, as though the house had let her walk away, but its hold on her had not loosened. The darkness was still there, lingering, waiting, and the shard in her hand was its key, its final whisper of life. The weight of her realization settled on her chest, suffocating, consuming. The house was gone, but something else was rising in its place, something far more insidious. She stood, the shard still clenched tightly in her hand, and for the first time, Isla understood the truth of her situation. The silence was not her salvation. It was her prison. The house had not been defeated. It had merely bided its time, waiting for her to set it free. And now, she was bound to it forever. Chapter 15. eclipse of the spirit. The morning came, but it did not bring peace. The sky was a dull gray, clouds hanging low like a thick, suffocating shroud. The air was heavy, as though the earth itself held its breath, waiting for something unseen to unfold. The house stood silent, but Isla could feel it. Feel its pulse beneath her skin. Feel the weight of its presence pressing against her very soul. The shadows had returned, creeping into the corners of her vision, hiding in the spaces between the cracks and the crumbling walls. Isla had spent the night in the room that had once been the heart of the house. She had slept little, the shard still clutched tightly in her hand, its cold edges biting into her palm like a warning. Every time she closed her eyes, the pulse of the shard resonated with the rhythm of her own heartbeat, each thrum a reminder that the house had not truly been silenced. Its echoes remained, and so did its hold on her. Now, as the first rays of the sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds, Isla stood at the edge of the ruined room, staring out at the decaying landscape before her. The house was no longer the towering, oppressive structure that had once loomed over her. Now, it was a hollow shell, its walls battered, its windows shattered, its heart broken. But the silence, that deafening quiet, remained, and it was worse than any sound. The absence of life, the absence of energy, was a presence in itself, and it wrapped itself around Isla like a cloak of despair. She stepped forward, her bare feet sinking into the dust-covered floor, and as she moved, she felt the weight of her own thoughts pressing against her mind. The house had changed, yes, but so had she. She was no longer the same person who had arrived here all those days ago, a girl desperate to escape her past. The house had carved something into her, something deep and irreversible. It had taken something from her, and in return, it had given her something dark, something she wasn't sure she could ever escape. Every step she took, every breath she drew, was a reminder that she was bound to this place. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a part of her, and the shard. She could feel its power still, pulsing with a faint, insistent beat, a rhythm that matched her own. It was as if the shard had become an extension of her, a part of her very being, and no matter how far she walked, no matter how far she tried to run, she knew she could never truly leave. The house was a part of her, and its shadows would always follow her. Isla turned from the window, her gaze sweeping across the wreckage of the room. The altar had collapsed, the remnants of its once sacred stones scattered across the floor. But even in its destruction, the house was not finished. The echo of its power lingered in the air, thick and palpable. It was as if the house were waiting for something, waiting for her to make the next move, waiting for the final shift that would bind her to it forever. Her fingers brushed against the walls, the rough stone cool beneath her touch. She could feel the vibrations, the faint tremors beneath the surface, like the house itself was holding its breath. There was nothing left here. No life, no energy, nothing but the hollow remnants of what had once been. And yet, the feeling of being watched, of being trapped in the house's gaze, never left her. Isla could hear it now, the faintest hum in the air, like the sound of something vast and ancient stirring beneath the earth. The house had never been a home, not in any sense she had ever understood. It had been a prison, a place where souls were bound, where darkness waited to consume all who crossed its threshold. She could feel it pulling at her, urging her to stay, to become a part of it. The darkness whispered to her, offering her the power of the house, the power that she had touched with the shard. It was hers, if she wanted it. All she had to do was let go, let the shadows consume her, and she would become one with them. She would be its master, its heir, and the house would never again let her go. Isla's breath quickened as the pull of the house grew stronger. She could hear its whispers now, clear and undeniable, calling her name. The shadows pressed against her, their cold fingers brushing her skin, their breath a chill that ran down her spine. But then, something else stirred within her. Something deep and ancient. Something that had been buried beneath the weight of the house's darkness. A flicker of light. It was faint at first, like the glow of a candle struggling to stay alight in a storm. But it grew stronger, brighter, until it was a flame that burned in the center of her chest. The power of the house, the darkness that had consumed her for so long, could not withstand it. The light was hers, a light she had carried all along, buried deep within her soul, waiting for the moment to rise. The shadows recoiled. The hum in the air faltered. The pulse of the house began to slow, its rhythm faltering as the light within Isla burned brighter, stronger. It was the heart of the house she had freed, but it was her own heart now that guided her. Isla stood tall, the shard still clutched in her hand, but now its power seemed distant, fading. The darkness that had once consumed her, the presence that had whispered in her ear, no longer held sway over her. She had become something else, something new. With a final, defiant step, Isla turned toward the door. The house had given her its gift, its curse, but she would no longer be its prisoner. The light within her was too strong. She would leave, and the shadows would never follow. As she crossed the threshold and stepped into the ruins of the world beyond, the house behind her trembled, its walls groaning under the weight of its own destruction. The pulse that had once dominated her every move had finally ceased. The silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the silence of a graveyard, the silence of something long dead. The house of shadows had finally fallen, and with it, the echoes of its dark power. Isla walked on, the light within her burning bright and undiminished. And though the house was gone, its legacy would endure. Etched into her very soul, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, there is always a spark of light that can set you free.